You can call me Jacob. When I was 6 years old, my father took me out camping one late summer afternoon. My grandmother had property which was quite large, and we hiked on the northeastern edge of her property. There were lots of trees, and the place we decided to camp had a lot of brush and overhanging trees. These were cottonwood trees, and they grew down in the lowlands of the area. We decided to go fishing, and the river itself was probably about half a mile from where we set up camp. We had a great day fishing and talking, and I ended up swimming. As the day grew later and afternoon turned into late evening, we both got an uneasy feeling. I told my father that I was ready to go and I wanted to go back to camp because I was afraid. He too appeared uneasy. However, he didn't show any type of fear. He gathered up our things quickly and we set off for camp. Of course, once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the night set in very quickly. We ended up making the last part of our trek through the complete darkness. As we got back into camp, my father lit a fire he'd prepped before we left. The fire burned to life, and we cooked marshmallows and hot dogs since we had come up empty-handed in our afternoon fishing. As we talked about stories, and my father told me about myths and legends and traditions of natives from this area and the area he's from. We enjoyed each other's company. It was one of the few times I can remember actually being with my father and having a very good time. He asked me, or rather made a statement towards me. He said, "You know fire is alive, right?" I looked at him curiously and asked him, "What do you mean, Dad?" My father told me, he said, "If you stare into the fire, you can see that it's a living being. Go on, look." I scooted forward and leaned down and began to stare at the fire. My father continued to speak. He said to me, "Fire breathes air just like we do. Fire consumes and eats fuel for survival, just as we consume food." And he said fire reproduces itself. Of course, not like we do, but it does in fact reproduce itself. As he finished speaking, I saw the tiniest flame leap forward onto a dry log and run up the length of it. This tiny flame was teardrop shaped, and underneath it had flickering legs, is the best way I could describe it. They propelled it up the log and it leapt into the other part of the fire. When I saw this, my eyes lit up, and I immediately turned back and looked at my father. He laughed and smiled as we'd seen the same thing at the same time. We continued to speak and talk, and actually, being a child, for the most part, I sat and listened. As the night wore on, something changed. As I was getting ready to turn in for the night and go lay down in my sleeping bag, my father stood up abruptly and spun away from the fire, looking into the darkness. I immediately came up behind him, and he put his hand behind him to keep me pushed back. I asked him, "Dad, what's wrong?" He whispered harshly, "Be still." I peered around the back of his legs, looking into the darkness for what it was that he had seen or felt. As I looked forward, I heard my father's voice ask me, "Do you see him, son? Do you see him standing there?" I squinted my eyes and I looked forward, straining to see anything in the darkness. My eyes were trying to adjust and focus. He said, "Look at the part of the night that is blacker than the rest." As I looked forward to the direction he looked, I did see something there. My father stood 6'6", and what I saw were a pair of eyes. They were gold, the color of honey, and they towered over my father's head. It made me gasp for a second, and I stood there frozen. The three of us stared at each other for what seemed like eternity. After about 30 or 40 seconds, whatever it was blinked and turned and walked away. My father told me it was time for me to go to bed and zipped me up in the tent. He said he would stay up for a bit longer. I never asked him, but I believe he stayed up the rest of the night. The next morning, he woke me for breakfast. After breakfast, he asked me if I wanted to go look for tracks, and so we did. We searched all through the area, through the sand and the mud, and we saw nothing. There were no tracks. When you see something or experience something, let's be honest, from the moment you see whatever it is you see, your world is a different place than it was just a second before that. Everything you believed that was real is no longer real after that point. to understand that the way you viewed the world was not the way it really was. There are so many things I need to speak with all of you about. There are things that most of you have never ever heard of before. They're real, and they're here. When I post again, I may go into some detail in some of the things that I'm speaking of. Until then, take care and stay out of the darkness.